he's not here.
Amazing.
I'm all powerful.
Oh, dear Lord.
It's all up here. Right
It's
here.
all up.
Okay. I will call the February 14th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and the public have been duly notified in accordance with state law. I tell you what, we've just had, you all have received a copy of the minutes. Nicole has just explained that there was a disruption in the recording and the internet feed of the last meeting's recordings. So I think they're substantially complete. There could be about 10 minutes or so of the last end of the meeting that got clipped from the recordings. Does anybody have anything that they would like for Nicole to add to these minutes that have been distributed, or is everybody okay with them as drafted? There were some things from my recollection that were agreed to from Davis and Floyd that they would send back to us in a scope of work. We've captured that kind of in their proposal of work. Other than that, I think it was just updates of various things that were afoot.
Done.
I'm fine with that.
That was,
Just approve them as submitted. Have a motion to that effect.
I'll motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Next order of business is nomination and election of chair and vice chair. I think we delayed this last month because we didn't have a complete group. Missing two. Right, two again this month. Do you all care to delay, or you want to go ahead and proceed with the group that's here?
Oh, we can proceed. What do you think, Cindy?
I'm fine with going forward, yeah.
Yes.
I nominate Ron Denton and
Okay,
do his thing.
This is the time
Continue.
This is the time to get David Cohen.
Well, I would like to do David Cohen as vice chair.
all right, nominations for chair. I have Ron. Without any other nominations, closed nominations?
No, he can't.
All in favor?
Such a great job the last couple of months.
All right, Ron, you've been elected chair, so if you'll take over for nominations and election of vice chair.
So, any nominations for the vice chair for this coming year?
I will nominate David, because he's not here and he can't say no.
That's right.
Second.
Any other nominations? We have a nomination and a second for David for vice chair. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's unanimous.
So, Chairman, a thing that's not on the agenda is public comment. We did have a request through the city clerk from Wallace Bonds to make some comments. I think he's here in the audience if the group is agreeable to hearing from him.
Of course.
Yes.
I'll be quick. The thing on the website, it says I get 3 minutes.
Yes.
I appreciate the fact y'all aren't sitting up on the highlights. It's very important. So,
Do you just use
I
the microphone?
appreciate.
You have to use the microphone so it'll be picked up by YouTube.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's good.
YouTube
Yeah.
can hear you more than anything else.
Okay, got it. And I talked to Mr. Cohen at length after I sent all y'all an email, so I'm sad that he's not here today. But it's very simple with the stormwater code. When new buildings are done, new houses are made, and they build the houses up, and then the water runs off onto adjacent properties. I've been working on this almost 4 years with Douglas, sometimes angrily because of what happened in my particular case, and I know it's happened to my neighbors, and Douglas even says that it happens frequently. I would just ask or encourage y'all, when you're looking at that language, and I've seen how it's being edited and what the language looks in there, you can still build houses up above the adjacent properties, but if y'all would consider the words will or must or shall for that code instead of, less strong words like may or should, for the builders and the civil engineers and the landscapers when they're completing the projects to ensure sure that the water doesn't run off and damage the adjacent properties, I think it would be greatly appreciated by the people that live next door to these houses that are being built. And then they have to deal with the after effects. So we're gonna continue to allow them to build the houses up, and if they don't do it right, the water's gonna run off. In my case, the water flows so strongly that it moves bricks in my yard, so it comes through like a creek. And again, I've been around about Douglas with this, sometimes angrily, over the past several years. I'm just trying to get the code changed and worded properly to protect others going forward, so things like that don't continue to happen. So, and I'm sorry David's not here, because he called me and we talked about it at length, so, but that's all I had to say. So did I make it under 3 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
I
So
do like
are
that
we-
y'all- I do
are
like
we-
that y'all sit around in a circle and look at each other and plan as opposed to sitting up here, so.
and this really is kind of directed at Douglas, but is he referring to the R on our page 3 of 3, 4R? I don't know that. It's not
On
4.
the-
I don't
on
know
the-
what- I'm sorry, that's not 4R.
May or shalls, that comment?
No lot shall be, in the red, it says improved, altered, black, graded, or filled in a way that results in more, is that what he's referencing, that?
The only may that I'm aware of is at the very bottom, and it has to do with Matt requiring, an as-built documentation certifying that the project was completed in, compliance with the plan. The reason that's a may is, these plans would get triggered for every single project, whether it's 2 acres or, on a lot created out in the middle of the marsh that can't run against anybody or towards anybody. We felt like May would give him flexibility. If it was clear it couldn't be negatively impacted somebody, he has some discretion there to say, okay, in your situation, clearly cannot be impacting anybody, so I'm not gonna require it. But, I don't know that we would have any great, issue with changing that may to shall.
I'm just asking, when y'all look at that part of the code, because last thing I saw online, there's a lot of crossed out stuff and red stuff, and it still looks like it's still very much in flux, the way it's written. If it's being rewritten, to make it strongly worded enough to where we don't allow this to happen in the future, to other folks, so.
Wallace, is your
I'm
comment?
not a civil engineer, and I don't know how to, I know this code hasn't been redone since 2004, so it's been 20 years, so I'm glad it's being looked at, so. What's that, Douglas?
Is your comment about the may, the only place we see may is on the follow-up documentation that a civil engineer sign off that it was done in accordance with the plan? That's the only may that I think is in here. Is that what you're
My
referencing?
comment is about the entire thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
When it's written, not.
I don't
just-
think
not
there's
just the
any
one-
other-
Not just the one
Or-
time that the word may is in there. My
Or
comment is
shall
about,
too.
when you're looking at that code to rewrite it with help from Davis and Floyd, I would just encourage and ask that y'all word it strongly enough to where people can't slip out of it and do stuff like not put, stuff in place like a drainage ditch or gutters or whatever's necessary to do the right thing with the water when it comes.
It may protect Matt too, because if you have a word like may in there, at your discretion to do so. Some people may, sorry about that one. It may be perceived as discriminatory, because somebody's gonna say, well, why did you do it for this person and then not for this person? So it could put you in a very precarious position.
So,
I think
For me,
Matt
it's-
has indicated, I think it's your preference to just get them as a matter of course and have people.
Especially for new houses. I don't know that. Well, we're excluding pools here anyway, so. Yeah. I like or the
A stronger language.
stronger, yeah, I like that too.
And I think in practice, that's how it's gonna be
It's easier
administered,
for
so.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
it's
So if we wanna change,
Gray area.
It's safer.
my more concern is defining what the as-built documentation would be. It could be anything from a statement of a landscaper or drainage engineer saying, yeah, they did it right. But it could also mean having as-bills done, resurveying the property for conformance. That's, when I started seeing it, that's where I went. There are people that may want, if you have a really complex drainage plan, probably would be incumbent to have an as-built survey done after the fact to make sure that the grades are established where they're supposed to be. But that's what my concern was, because the amount of time and effort and money to get that survey done, adjudicated, have the civil engineer or landscape architect then review that. You know, that's on one extreme. The other extreme is getting somebody to say, yeah, they did it right.
Yeah, so I'll just tell you and we do this already, and we did it on the neighboring house to Mr. Bond's house that was built, that we have the original designer go back out, they shoot the elevations. If there's differences between what got approved and what's physically installed, they note those differences, so they kind of redline the plans. And then there's a certification statement, and then they basically change that statement to say, I'm following up, and it was done in accordance with this plan. So they do. They actually change the topography on the plan to show what's been installed, and then they recertify that, yes, this is in fact. But to your point, if that's what we do in practice, I don't think there's any harm in spelling that out, that it would be a resurvey. And it's done by, and I don't know if we would say a survey, because the drainage plan itself is not a surveyed document. I mean, it is a plan, and then they redraw the plan. They're not surveyors, they're designers. So I think we could, though, expand that language a little bit to refer back to the section that describes what's in the original plan.
Problem is, the plan is a bad plan, and the way the code's written now, correct me if I'm wrong, Douglas, they come out and they say the construction was done according to the plan, so good to go, we sign off on the certificate of occupation, but if the plan was a bad one and the water's still running off anyway, it doesn't matter, just because they constructed it to the plan, but the plan didn't work, then you've got a problem. So I think it needs to be, and again, I'm not a civil engineer, but it needs to be resurveyed to see if what they did actually functions the way they said it would.
Well,
Yeah,
that would
Miss-
be pretty easy to see, if you state the goals of the plan. And if it doesn't work.
I can only speak in my case. The plan that they showed me had all the water staying on the property, and it doesn't, because gravity does its thing, and it comes over, and it moves bricks around. So I can just tell you, and they came out and looked at it and certified that it was built according to the code and the plan.
Yeah, that,
And it didn't get fixed, so.
in his situation, and I think this is, I think he's the only one that's had this exact situation, but in his situation, I think it was a civil engineer, developed the plan, certified it will not adversely impact the neighbor. They built the project. Mr. Bonds had the issues he's described to you all. We then contacted the owner and told them, you're going to have your designers come back out, recertify it. And they did that. They came back out, and indeed they said, this is a little low here, this is a little high here. They may have modified the terrain a bit to tweak it, but they got the terrain in alignment with the plan, which was in accordance with the civil engineer's vision, and he recertified it. Yes, this is what I envisioned, it's working properly. I'm hereby certifying it's not adversely impacting the neighbor. Submitted that to us. Mr. Bonds feels like it's still negatively impacting him.
Not to be argumentatively, Douglas, but what they did was they came out and they put in 4 pieces of sod next to the drainage ditch and said, this will work. When this grows in, it'll stop it from happening. And they got a different civil engineer to come out there and sign off that the work had been done correctly. So, and again, I mean, you're the one that told me this happens frequently, and I know a couple of neighbors it's happened to. So I'm just trying to do what I can to
I don't think
make
that
sure it doesn't happen going forward. That because if you come in and you allow them to build up, the water's going to run to the surrounding houses unless they do something. So And two of my neighbors behind me have the same thing going on. They just don't want to complain and make waves. I'm just trying to help out the code, get it right in the future so people don't get screwed over. But the way it's currently written, based on what I experienced and based on what I've heard, anecdotally, is that it's still very slippery and people can get out of doing the job right. And in my opinion, it's allowing vandalism to happen.
So just to clarify, and I'm not sure what you're referencing that I said happen frequently, but your situation definitely does not happen frequently. You're the only one that I'm aware of that's had as acute a problem as you have had in your view. There have been people certainly concerned about their neighbor but I don't know. I mean, Matt's been doing it for a couple of years now, but I don't think we've ever had anybody who felt like after they, for a second time, certified that it wouldn't be adversely impacted. And I know that we haven't had that. You're the only one that's ever had that.
Well, I mean, you emailed me that it happened frequently, and again,
I have to look at what I was referencing, 'cause it wasn't.
What happens is that people, it happens to them, and they get a landscaper to come in and build their yard up to combat it or something like that. So I'm just think that we could, with the code, fix issues like that from having happen going forward. But
So I think I'm hearing you say that you feel like this is still, I mean, this paradigm is pretty close to the way it is now. It's modified, it has some additional kind of beef to it, but it sounds like you're saying that you think that it still will lead to the same.
no, I'm sorry, but I'm very encouraged. I mean, because I've been pecking at y'all about this for almost 4 years. So I'm very encouraged that they're paying attention to it, that the city council's paid attention to it, that Davis and Floyd, the engineers, came out to my house and talked to me a couple of years ago and got details. And I'm very encouraged that we're finally looking at the code 20 years later to see what can be done to improve it. So I hope this will.
So you're happy with what's,
I would like to make sure it's worded strongly enough so that people can't slide out of doing the job correctly. So, but again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how to write government documents, and I'm not a civil engineer. So just like to give the benefit of my experience and hope some wording can be done strong enough to keep it from happening to people. Because again, I guess I just will be argumentative with it. It's still happening. So, in fact, I talked to David Cohen, and he knows some people that it's happened to. So I disagree with you that you think it's not happening, because it is. If you allow people to come in and build their lots up above other people's, it's going to happen. It's just gravity. So, okay. I've been here way longer than 3 minutes. Am I in trouble?
3 minutes, and that's not up to me to decide.
Well, and I know you don't like long meetings, because I've heard you say before you don't, so I'm making it longer. But anyway, I appreciate y'all volunteering your time and doing this stuff. So I emailed y'all. Everybody has my phone number and email. If you want additional comments, I'll be glad to talk to anybody about it. So thank y'all again. Thanks, Douglas.
all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all have a good one.
I think what we're doing is adequate. I actually had made a note kind of on the reverse. I know where there's some older properties in our community, some in Forest Trail, one in particular, 2102 Waterway Boulevard, right as you come around the bend, that's always holds water in their front yard, right up to the front door when we have these, inch-an-hour rains. And they should be able to fill that and make that water run off or percolate down through their lot. And this kind of, and that was my question. I'm going somewhere. Hold please. Are we, in the wording here, no lot shall be improved, altered, graded, or filled in a way that results in more storm water running off the site or in storm water running off the site quicker? When you have a property that's ponding, your front yard is it turns into a lake. The way I read this, I can't fill that to cause it perhaps to be level with the road, which in essence may create a water runoff situation?
Yeah, this was a little bit about what we kind of were asking Davis and Floyd to potentially analyze was if a lot has been low and holding water, and we have to your same point and farther down in the next section, post-construction runoff will mimic pre-construction runoff. So that, in your example, if a property had zero runoff, it would have to continue to have zero runoff. And then if you look at their neighbor, who, let's just say hypothetically, they were built in 1978 and they covered the entire lot with concrete, and it's running off every drop instantly, they would be allowed to mimic that. So we are giving a lot of deference to the condition of the site as it were prior to
Do we need,
work.
David's up
yeah.
there
I don't think-
wandering from door to door.
Oh, it is.
Now he's
4:30,
in, David's here.
the 4:30 change, got him.
It's our vice
I
chair.
looked it up like something else is going on. Where'd they go?
Welcome, vice chair.
Congratulations.
Yeah?
That'll teach you not to show up one time.
They tried to make you chair, David.
Oh,
Somebody defended you and took the bullet and it was wrong.
And yet again, it says in here that you can, at the very beginning of this whole thing, provided however that this requirement shall not limit the elevation of any lot lower than 7.4. Meaning that we're gonna keep them at 7.4? Can I build up to that?
Yes, so the way the code works now is you can go 1 foot above the road, period. We have situations where the road is really low. The road is 5 feet above sea level. So we're holding a brand-new house and their slab and their yard to 6 feet above sea level, which we know in areas in the back of the island, 6 feet, that's gonna get flooded. We have that condition. We had that with a subdivision in the Forest Trail area where they bought 3 lots, tore them all down, had 5 lots, and now I think we have 5 new houses. Some of those were on a hill and they're up decently, but we do have a lot of houses that we've forced to be down at elevations we know, with the recent events that we've had with water inundation, we have forced them to put slabs and yards down at elevations that would be subject to tidal inundation. So Davis and Floyd suggested 7.4 feet and saying, okay, that 1 foot above the road standard has generally been okay, but in those situations where it's putting you below 7.4, we're gonna allow you to go up to at least 7.4. So this would account for those situations that have a really, really low road in front of the properties. I don't think, 7.4 is a pretty good level of protection. We've now been kind of hyper-focused on recent tidal inundation
December
events.
17th.
Yep, and that got to right at 7, just below 7 on the NAVD 88 datum. So we think 7.4 is good by just a little bit. And we think that would, kind of trying to balance the historic ordinance of keeping things down and not allowing you to build up and run water to your neighbor, but also account for this tidal, inundation issues. They're thinking 7.4 is a good number, and I think that bears out to be.
so based on this language, if someone was going to be building on a lot and the road was lower, they needed to go up, they were gonna go up to 7.4, they would still have to then look at and get a stormwater plan so it did not
Correct.
adversely affect their neighbors' properties.
That's correct. And
Which
we,
is a
Which would be
difficult,
tricky, yeah.
which is tricky.
Build a moat around your property.
yeah, and we've added in this provision that says you have to mimic pre-construction, the pre-construction conditions. So if you, and Sandy's example is probably the hardest one to deal with, where you were, the low point, you always collected all the water. Are we gonna make you continue to collect all the water? And I think we've had discussions about, you were at a negative runoff. I think we're saying you can't increase it, but you can hold zero, I think we've kind of said. Because that's actually running, we're measuring the other direction, which would be a positive. So we're not saying you have to continue to be negative, but you can go to zero where you've been a negative.
Okay.
Are we taking into consideration what's coming off the road? Because a lot of times you'll have a gutter, right, and downspout, and it's directing it off your property, down your driveway, maybe out to the road, or it's supposed to go into a drainage ditch or the drain, not necessarily going out to your neighbor's property.
So
All the water coming off the road is going through somebody's property to another.
So, on that one, I would take you to that's what we're trying to prevent.
Mr. Cohen,
People
can
putting-
you get near a microphone?
Sorry.
Just, YouTube won't catch you, thank you.
I would take that as that's what we're trying to prevent, that you would have to hold that on your property, because all our roads have a right-of-way. So the right-of-way should compensate for the drainage of water landing on the road. What it doesn't account for is water running off of somebody's property that pushes into the road.
Wasn't that the point of the drainage?
But we don't have drainage ditches on a lot of, that's the problem with the
Direct
island.
Water to that, so it
We don't have a
sources out.
drainage plan for the island yet.
Yeah, that's our problem, is we don't have, if we had a nice drainage system, but the water hits the road, goes to the lowest yard on the road, and then runs into their yard. So, I mean, if you're on and I think that's kind of the way in the county, if you're on a drainage system that has the ability to collect water, then you could go through when you do your engineering, when you do your analysis to say
Direct it
that
to that.
this system has the capacity to carry water off the property, then you should be allowed to do it, but that becomes more of a kind of judgment call when y'all are reviewing plans, that just showing it go to the street, unless you show where it ends up, you can't guarantee that it's not going to a neighbor's property.
Well, I'm new to this. Is there any consideration to a pervious road system? And if they're out there, just done a little bit of research on it. Because when we clear off the road, we make it pervious.
Yeah, the issue that I think that's a good idea, the probable issue we have is our roads are all DOT roads. They are just folded into their maintenance and repaving program. That's a county-wide repaving program, the 1%. So I don't know that we could, it wouldn't be our.
Square footage, but
It wouldn't be our judgment. We could certainly ask, and I don't know. And I do actually know that they have done projects for us with asphalt that they claim is pervious. When they did the little park detour at the bottom of the connector, they used what they call pervious asphalt. I don't know how pervious that is with the road bases that they put. I mean, it's massive, very compacted road bases, so I don't know how much gets through there, but I think that would be a little bit outside of our control. It's a DOT road, it's a county paving program. I think we could ask. I'm guessing that if it wasn't an easy kind of just switch to turn, that it would be, I don't know what their comment would be.
I mean, every little bit helps.
So, we left our last meeting having had discussions with Davis and Floyd engineers about what we have in here now, and we talked a little bit about the fact that the way that we're currently worded, we're very much letting the pre-construction conditions drive the design. We asked them to do a little bit of work in terms of trying to figure out kind of a design standard. We talked a little bit about 10-year storm over a longer duration or a higher storm over a shorter duration. So they had some different ideas to go back and look at, to come back with suggestions. They did, I didn't realize this at the time, but they were seeing that as an additional scope for their work. So they've provided us with an estimate to do that work, and they've estimated between the range of $15,000 and $20,000 to do that work. So I didn't want to, and that amount would require council approval, may require kind of a competitive process potentially to get a few quotes. And I didn't know if that was, I guess I wanted to get a kind of feel from this group. From my standpoint, I thought it was being offered, so we kind of took them up on their offer. I don't know if I was seeing it through the lens of hiring somebody for that amount of work, and I guess if I was going to see it through that lens, we might handle it a little bit differently and talk to a couple of engineers and get their thoughts about the work product. But do you all have a sense for whether or not that analysis is something that you would like to have for this process? And I think if your answer is yes, I think I would go back and potentially talk to a couple of engineers, get a couple of proposals and choose from that. And then there obviously would be a process to getting that approved through
I think it
council.
would be a big help. I mean, as they mentioned in their presentation, their engineers, they look at drainage on the much bigger picture than an individual lot drainage plan. So by having them engage in thinking about drainage from that scale, it might help us to establish that
Need to be closer.
all those parameters have.
I think I just discovered that the rolling chairs we'll need to use next time, so it gives y'all to the table, because it's good to be around, but I'm noticing that y'all are,
Leaning back.
It's too comfortable.
everybody's kinda like,
Yeah, it's really comfy.
Yeah.
So this is the, you really can't,
Yeah,
there's a
closer.
kind of
can't get
wall
in
there.
there. So if you notice, everybody kind of stays.
well, I just want but,
Well, you literally
Effectively,
can't,
that's
you
correct.
can't tuck your,
I know,
Legs
we'll
in.
just, well, next time we'll just take those off and put the chairs there, so y'all can, sorry, but it's not picking up anything back here.
so lean forward.
Testing.
Sit at the edges of your seat and lean forward.
Or just pull your microphones closer to
So
you.
nothing I say is being recorded.
Well, get you in there.
Yeah.
I guess I'm sure we detail.
But going back, I think if they can look at things at a scale of a lot as opposed to scale of a quadrant of the island in terms of acres, I don't know of any community that has done that, and I think that would be a big help in trying to figure out how we handle the design of a single lot drainage system. We don't even quite know what we're asking for. You know, we could do all the rain gardens in the world, and that'll work great until you have a December 17 again, where nothing's gonna work.
I will say, yeah, my kind of thoughts on that was, however many years ago, we kind of acted drainage ordinances that was kind of written to hold the line. And I guess where we are today, those weren't well written, and so I kind of, what I perceive is that we didn't hold the line for the last, whatever, 10 or 12 years, that we progressively let things slide a little bit, get worse over time. We're cleaning up the language, but we're not going back. So hopefully what the language we have now is gonna stop us from continuing to increase drainage problems, but it's not gonna fix anything that's occurred over the past however many years when we weren't holding to a stricter ordinance. And that gets back to kind of the path forward is, if we're okay, just, okay, we've stopped it, it's not gonna get any worse, it may not get a whole lot better until we do something different. Or do we wanna go back and look at, can we strengthen it so that we actually start going the other direction? And that's where I think Davis employed would or somebody would come in. I don't understand enough about drainage to make a call of what is the right wording to say, can we set limits so that we can kind of start reversing what's happened over the last, probably 20 or more plus years. And that's, I guess, to me, that's more kind of a question for council of, my feelings is we should go back the other direction, try to go back, reverse what's happened. But if it's a kind of a judgment call of if we were good just holding the line and figuring out what's the next big major project that the city can take on to try to start fixing this, there's no sense us getting advice that's not gonna be followed. So it's really if they're okay holding the line, if they want us to look at making something that starts kind of reversing what's happened over the last few years, I think we need somebody else, an engineering firm to come help us.
So just to kind
Does that
of,
make sense?
well, and I think it does, but I guess kind of philosophically, if we're asking somebody who develops, when I hear reverse, kind of to go the other way, I guess I'm understanding that to be if there is a communal drainage shortcoming, you're kind of putting the burden on improving that, and maybe it's incremental, it's a tiny
Right.
increment, but you're kind of putting the burden of repairing that on individuals developing a new home. And I guess I don't know philosophically if that's to ask them to do some additional work to fix problems created by the community so I don't know if reversing, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly.
That may not be the right answer. I mean,
Moving forth.
Huh?
You say moving forward.
moving forward,
We want to aggressively
Take-
mitigate.
taking actions that would help reduce drainage issues on the island. What we've done now is not gonna reduce it, it's gonna keep it from growing, but it's not probably gonna reduce our issues.
So actually run off less. Are we thinking that a new house potentially could be designed to run less water off after the project than it did prior to the project?
Yes. I think in a lot of cases, again, kind of go back to, the lot coverage. We have, probably lots that are 50% coverage now. But kind of the way it's written is, from the runoff standpoint, okay, they can reduce their footprint to be, if the house is rebuilt, but they can still run off as much water as they've always run off. So we've not gained anything. So instead of putting something like sloping the yard the other direction or putting in a retention pond or, some kind of impervious drainage system, they can just let the water continue to run off, and which is probably the cheaper, solution. So do we put that back on to, not only do you have to reduce your footprint, but you also have to reduce your drainage, and that may it may or may not run into more expenses. And that's, that kind of question, that's, I guess, where an engineering company that knows this stuff could help us and say, at what point does it become burdensome on a land, somebody to try to retain the water on their own property? What is that point where can they retain 50% with really almost very little cost? Or I don't know the answer to that. That's kind of where.
You're talking about with new construction, right?
Well, new or remodeling, or again, if you're impacting what our limits are, do you have to, again, it goes back to the guy that runs the water from his house down a pipe out to the street. Well, he can reduce it by just disconnecting that pipe and letting the water drain across his yard. There's very little expense in doing something like that, but we don't require it, so why would I want to do it? Because I know right now, without an issue, I just let it run out into the street. And that's what I said, our ordinance currently doesn't give anybody any incentive not to keep pushing the water off the property.
So, Suzanne, we currently, it gets triggered at a development of 625 square feet or more.
Right.
And we would require that their plan account for that additional coverage, and the way it's worded now after that project, the stormwater runoff would have to be the same, basically, as it was prior to that project. So that's kind of the way it's written. And I think what David is saying is maybe, and I think this does get back to the discussion we had with Davis and Floyd, is if somebody was 80% covered and all they have to do is match pre-existing, they could continue to kind of run it which way, instead of kind of turning it back to some other condition, which I guess is where we might need an engineer.
So what if you did it like on a graduated scale? You know, because what, our coverage, lot coverage is 35% if you're on city sewer.
Yeah. And
Or-
30 if you're septic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So for lots that are over, if they did major remodeling. If
So
they're
if lots
lot
that are over,
coverage-
we do make them bring the lot coverage down. But I think that's one of David's points is, even if they bring the lot coverage down to 35%, all we've really made them say is you're not gonna run any more water off. So they could theoretically drop lot coverage, but run the exact amount of
To
water.
give an example, if I had a concrete driveway, my gutter drained onto the driveway, so all the water just rushes out,
Right,
goes around the corner. I could go back and say, I'm gonna put an impervious driveway in, you know, if I hit the limits, and then I'm gonna run a drain pipe beside my driveway to take
Right.
that same water out to the street. So I've not really changed a whole lot as far as my effect outside of my property. And that's kind of, I guess, that's kind of where, how do you word it, or how do you write an ordinance to say, no, you can't get away doing that, you've gotta reduce it.
Is that a little too granular, though?
That's a very
It
granular
is.
example, I'm saying,
How
yeah.
many of those do we have that we really need to worry about and spend money on to perhaps fix in some
Well, in that
ordinance?
example, it would cost me more to reroute the water to run off into the street than it would just to let it go over. So but if I'm worried about where that water goes, I'd rather it go on my neighbor's property than mine, then I'm gonna spend the extra money. And that kind of goes back to that's why I kind of use that example, is people are gonna do that unless we write something that says specifically, figure out some other solution. Run your drain line to the other side of your property.
Part of me sits here and thinks about, well, I think we've addressed a lot of that with the reduction in the lot coverage, 35%. Some of the wording in here, I think, addresses that specifically, shall not, means you can't. Where am I looking here?
The shells were up there.
No lot shall be, blah, 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 can't run more water off than it already does. To your point, if you're running it down the driveway and you keep doing that, then, you know, okay. I think that's permissible. I don't see it as
Well,
more,
so that was kind of my point
which
is,
is what is,
if
we're
the-
not doing.
if the house was built 10 years ago, and because we didn't regulate to the same standard, they increased the amount of runoff because we weren't enforcing it as well as we hoped to. Now, just because you did it 10 years ago, which was not the intent behind the ordinance, you're now still allowed to continue doing it? Or do we kind of write it so that those issues get fixed? And we actually start reducing the amount of runoff that's hitting our low-lying properties.
I just wanna fill the low-lying property.
Let them deal with it.
Up to
And how
seven point
much-
4 feet.
How much is less runoff? So that's a real problem.
Well, that's, again, that becomes, that's the engineering, it's, can you say 10%?
Yeah, we can't, we're not qualified.
We're not,
to
yeah.
Dream up that ordinance.
You know,
We need science off.
Can you just show, like I said, as an example, and I don't know if this makes sense, but, lots over whatever, 40% coverage must show a 10% reduction in runoff. Now, when you say that, that's gonna involve a whole engineering analysis to determine what it was,
Which they
what
should be
it
doing
is.
for that drainage plan now anyway.
Well,
Yeah, but what if they don't have
I mean,
any
they'll be
runoff,
doing
and then
hydrology.
You're requiring them to do 10% more, and they already don't have it.
well, yeah, again, yeah, I don't know.
Non-conforming. Can I ask a quick question? I wasn't here last week. What was your, what do you remember your wording was for what you were asking Davis and Floyd to do that we're talking about?
Yeah, so that, this is getting to the question that we were asking of Davis and Floyd. Is there a kind of magic number that we could universally apply across the island that says something to the extent of, something like, you have to retain, you have to design your drainage plan to retain the first 30 minutes of a 10-year storm, and then after that, it can leave at X rate. So kind of a, and they were gonna look at kind of some typical lots and try to analyze what it would kind of look like in the field, how much it would, what would that cost, would it be a practical application? So it would be getting away a little bit from mimic pre-construction conditions and go to a more kind of uniform engineering standard that, an engineer looking at a piece of property could design around. So that was that, and they were gonna look at, and we had some discussions about maybe it should be a higher intensity of storm, but over a shorter period. Maybe it should be a lower intensity in storm, of kind of what the different parameters would be that we might work towards. But in kind of a nutshell, that's what it was. Having them analyze a few real sites to figure out what a good threshold would be for us to include in our ordinance to really take the place of mimicking pre-construction conditions. It would not say that. It would say to achieve X, retaining the first 30 minutes of a
So I'm
rainstorm.
gonna remodel my house and add 630 feet, is that the
625.
625? Well, 630 does
Okay.
it. That
Yeah,
starts
that
the ball
triggers
rolling.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna have to do a stormwater, survey and determine what you're talking about to perhaps come up to a standard that maybe we
Right. I mean, that would be, so that a new home was probably a pretty easy one
right.
for them to deal with. I think we would need to analyze, these kind of incremental improvements. You're putting on a small addition. I don't know that it would be realistic to say, okay, you're adding on a bedroom. We need you to completely reconfigure your lot. And I think that we would just have you account for that 625 square feet, but we never got to that level of detail. Is that everybody else's, anybody else have a different recollection of what we were asking
I think that was
Davis?
kind of it. And I'll go back to, a new construction, it would be easy because we are gonna require you to do a complete drainage plan and pay the extra engineering cost to do the analysis or whatever. So it's more in the kind of reconstruction, like you said, if you're gonna add a 630 square foot section onto your house. But if you could show where you're draining the water off that house to a retention ditch or something or a pit that you built in, then you still wouldn't have to do the whole analysis of the whole yard if you just could account for it in that part of the design. I would think would be the way that the city would accept it. And that's the part did kind of concern me is, having, I don't know how much it costs to have a analysis done correctly. I would think, probably a couple $1,000s. I don't want to see that done on somebody that's actually doesn't need to have somebody of a firm come in.
So in other jurisdictions, for things like an addition, they'll review the existing drainage patterns of the property. And if your addition hasn't affected that, then they kind of let you off the hook. So it's kind of like two different things, drainage patterns on the existing property and then the containment of surface water. They're two really different things.
Right.
again, I've always been told drain water to the street when you can, or to your drainage ditch if you have one somewhere. And our streets can't handle it. So we have all these wonderfully pristine, dolled up drainage plans in our little lot. And the road in front of my house is still gonna be ponding because it wasn't designed properly. You know, so, but retention of water is different than drainage patterns. And so what you're saying, if you're doing an addition, you're not really affecting the drainage pattern of the site, but you want to contain that 650 square feet of surface area runoff, whatever that amounts to. I mean, you could easily do that with what I call the rain garden, you know, the big hole with the gravel and the
Yeah.
drainage things, and they're simple to do once more people do them. You know, if they were to do their pervious driveways properly, those are other wonderful, great, you know, rain detention systems.
Yeah.
But you need 18 inches of gravel, and a lot of people don't do that.
So, along that line of thinking, and I think that, you know, Matt and I have talked about, and I think David, we've talked too about, so there's this idea, and we could certainly go the direction of hiring engineers, coming up with, you know, what the storm design intensity is and come up with a plan. I guess my fear is if we go in that direction, that plan gets implemented. And let's just get back to your example of the engineer, let's say, didn't design the gutter to go, you know, they had the gutter stopping here. I guess the concern would be they get their CO, a gutter gets added, which in all these projects, I mean,
Yeah.
over the course of the ownership of a house, things change. And I would hate to have such a kind of sophisticated system that one little tweak that some next owner unknowingly undoes completely throws all of that to the wolves, and undoes it. And I guess I would have a concern about it being so sophisticated from a, you know, we're not civil engineers
Right.
administering this, it has the issues going forward. I think that, you know, we've talked about just a calculation, like if you cover 3,500 square feet, you have to account for some way in a rain garden or some other method that's very easily calculatable. That's a word, I don't know what that is. You know, that equates to some size retention area.
There's gotta be I mean, I know there are formulas, I just don't know them.
And it's this size stone in this volume of chamber. We can go measure it. Anybody can kind of see it. And then the yard has to be kind of pitched in a way that it goes, so it's not
Right.
something that you go to Lowe's and you just extend your gutter and you've thrown it all off. It's, you know, it's kind of built into the
Right.
site and you can't really undo it very easily, or is there, I mean, from y'all's perspective, is that a path? Is there a way to come up with something kind of simple, stupid that would achieve similar?
I think
That's why
there
we want
is.
the engineer.
And the way to do it is get it away from the engineers. So, you know, there are some landscape architects that do drainage plans, and they're not complicated like engineers, which probably suits us better because we don't have engineers on staff to review these drawings either. But if there was some good math that achieves the same thing without 16 equations to get you to a 2-equation solution, then I think it would just be better for everybody. There are some just land area, there's absorption of soil calculations and runoff information you can get anywhere. So you can make those calculations, but the more you can simplify it and, you know, make it less complicated, round up, you know, as opposed to going to, you know, 16-part formulas to get a solution, I think, you know, is a better.
Yeah, if somebody,
I think I'd probably sit those to you a while back, was looking through how some other cities have done it and stuff. One of the ones I came across, which I thought was really interesting, was they defined any pervious area had to be drained to an equal area of impervious surface, or natural surface.
Right.
Following you.
Going, which
So
would be very,
7,000 square foot house
so if you had a
has
1,000,
to go directly to 7,000 square feet of,
probably a better example is, you know, a 3,000 square foot house, 1,000 square feet of the roof in the front of the house flows into the setback area, which is 25, 1,000 square feet. So if you direct your runoff, goes back to the flow pattern, to that area, then I don't have to do anything else. Now, if I gutter it and drop it all to a single point, then I gotta figure out how to spread it back over that area, which landscapers can do. And so it's just a change of the mindset of, instead of what you were saying before, is just push it off the property, is no, I've pushed it to a equal area of the property. And I don't have to do any engineering calculations. Now, if I wanna come back and put a, quote, impervious driveway, I gotta show that that driveway creates no runoff, so that it can retain, goes back to what he was saying, that it's deep enough so it retains the water that falls on it. Whatever that value may be. And again, if you take those kind of basic best practices, I don't think you should have to go hire an engineering firm to come in and say, I need all the design criteria. If you're gonna go beyond doing kind of basic best practices, then yes, you're gonna have to get an engineering firm to show, I need a pit this big to accept all the water, because I wanna plant rock beds in my front yard instead of grass, and it won't hold the water.
so back kind of to a comment you made about subgrades on pervious surfaces. And Matt has now become an expert at dumping 5-gallon buckets into various surfaces, seeing how far it runs, measuring the time it
Yep.
takes to run. What about, and I don't know that we are aware of like 18 inches. I mean, and so we do see some that are putting a massive rock bed. We see some that are little to no rock bed. We see some that are a rock bed, but then there's a layer of pretty impervious stuff on top of that. I mean, maybe that's a partial way to get to it, is to say, you're, right now, and we've intentionally left it very open. You can achieve, as long as it's not concrete, we have been pretty,
Right.
because the example is made of hard packed dirt it's not impervious, obviously, the dirt, but it doesn't allow, you'll see standing water over hard packed dirt all the time. Maybe a step in the right direction would be, instead of just not being impervious, we actually require that it be some type of retention and a holding, an 18-inch deep surface on the entire front of your house. That might achieve,
While you're
A lot
doing your
just like-
driveway, it's not costing you much more. You're already
Just gravel.
scraping dirts away and just adding more gravel.
and we also kind of wrestle with the amount of voids in it, in the pattern, in the
Aggregate size.
and then the aggregate size within the gaps, all of that kind of stuff. We have very much been, going, a lot of industry standards are different. Some paver manufacturers say this is pervious, others are, so they're all over the boards in terms of, we have actually now had a surface that somebody poured, and it was concrete. From my naked eye, not a materials scientist, but to my naked eye, it was concrete. Guy was swearing up and down, this is pervious. Matt took a bucket of water, poured it over, it just sat on top of the concrete for 15 or 20 minutes. And then they came back and they said, well, eventually it did disappear. So, well, it's sunny out, and people are using,
The pervious
Somewhat
concrete, you can put a
porous.
hose on it and
Yeah.
the water disappears.
but so maybe that would be kind of moving the needle
Yeah.
a little bit if we just said, your hardscape surfaces, and we're already kind of used to dealing with those, instead of just being pervious, maybe we're gonna say they have to be 18 inches thick, 57 stone, or whatever the
There's
right
2
size
layers,
aggregate.
Yeah.
whatever they are.
That might get us a lot of the way there.
And again, that'd be kind of a question I would have for somebody is it goes back to the rainfall that we expect and how much water, because gravel holds, what, 40%, kind of generally? So
Yeah,
12
Even then it's
12
rain.
inches of gravel holds 4 inches of rain,
sure, yeah.
roughly. And, so yeah, depending on what we set as the limit of what we're expecting you to compensate for, that would determine how thick we would need to be with like a gravel layer. And again, goes back to, am I putting additional water into that impervious surface more than what we're designing to retain just the rain that falls on it? Or does it have to acquire, more than that?
So could we get to a formula that says, again, I'm gonna just for round numbers say, a 2,000 square foot roof has to run through, I completely don't know the number here, but it has to run through 1,000 cubic feet of volume of gravel. And if you can get it either by your driveway, if your driveway is small, that then says, okay, you couldn't quite get enough cubic feet in your driveway, you're now gonna have to add some of these rock gardens or some other way of getting the volume of gravel that you're running it through and come up with just a standard.
Quick thought, at what lot coverage are we requiring that?
So we would make it, we'd leave our lot coverage the same, but we would just say, and it would be an amount per square foot covered. So 2,000 square, and I'm just, again, I have no idea what it would be, but something to the effect of 2,000 square feet of coverage has to run through 1,000 cubic feet of stone, either in your driveway, in your yard, wherever you want to put it. And it could either be, I guess that stone could either be deep and wide, or it could be shallow. You would just
Shallow,
have
wide,
to, shallow and wide,
or
or
narrow
deep.
or deep.
You could kind of
Just square
choose the volume however you chose, but you would have to show that all of your impervious surfacing ran through the equivalent, whatever the appropriate amount of pervious volume is. Does that make sense to anybody?
Well, I'm sitting here thinking about my house, my roof, and it sheds on all 4 sides, so the gables are all working nicely. And it goes into the sand and percolates down through the sand at my house. I don't have with December 17th exception, those extreme rains we have occasionally. But the normal rain, everything is going into my lot, and I'm probably 40%. In fact, I know I am in terms of coverage with my driveway and the house, and decks and all that fun stuff. So I kind of exceed where we are right now with lot coverage. If I want to do something different, I know I'd have to go, I'm on sewer, so I'd have to meet the 35%.
So Sandy, your house I think if your house is, just not to talk so directly about your lot, but if your lot is big enough that I think if you're at 40%, you have a lot of concrete. You have a lot of surfacing other than roof. Is
I
that
have
correct?
a long driveway that we pulled up and put down pervious surface.
And you think you're still at 40?
Yes, but I
You
do
were at
still
like
have,
50 or something?
no, I wanted to put in a swimming pool and have the deck around the
So you
pool.
got it down to 40. You
Correct.
pulled up all of your driveway
No, about half of it.
to get it under the
Yeah,
lot coverage.
yeah. So I'm trying to think, I wouldn't be able to do anything else that would trigger anything. How would I do that? I can't do it probably at my lot.
to add something, I mean, if
Yeah.
you're at 40, we would require you to get back to
Back to
35.
35, yeah.
To do any kind of, see, I mean, and there are lots that are just kind of maxed
Well,
out.
for whatever purposes, say I'm at 30 and I wanna put an addition on it and get to 35. Again, my point is that everything currently runs off and percolates through a sand lot right now, with the exception of a section of driveway.
So that, kind of what you've described, is the model that we have, I mean, that is kind of how the
That-
That,
community.
that's kind
is-
of go back to where I was saying is, I don't think you actually necessarily need a pit for every square foot of impervious. I don't know whether, again, would make sense to say anything over a certain level would now require a pit. But it goes back to Sandy's point is, I almost think that you could do 50% lot coverage, and if you planned it right, you could retain everything on the lot without any runoff and without a pit or
Well, and
a
that's
rain
where I'm
garden.
kinda going, is what will trigger having to do a 12 or 18-inch gravel, holding, water garden? What's gonna trigger it?
So, I mean, we talked on, so if we were to have gone this route, or if we go this route, if you were to build a brand new house, you build your house today, and we had adopted this scheme, we would make you, for your house, run through a certain amount of volume of gravel. Sounds like you already have a lot of it under your pervious driveway. I don't know what the ratio, we obviously haven't gotten to figuring out what the ratio would be, but that would be kind of how the model would work, is we'd make you run your water over the gravel in your driveway. And we'd just be using kind of pulling together best guesstimates as to what the appropriate ratio would be to keep you from adversely impacting your neighbor. But to your point, the way your property has been developed is historically kind of how it's been done. We have just thought that the lot coverage limit would have the effect of taking care of the storm.
Well, I guess that's kind of what I'm falling back to. Are we duplicating or further complicating something we kind of perhaps fixed with the reduction in lot coverage from 40 down to 35 and 30, depending upon your septic sewer system?
So not to now pick on somebody else, but I'm gonna ask David, so it sounds like in your
You go ahead.
situation, it works, and it hasn't impacted your neighbor. In Mr. Bond's situation, and he lives in an area where there is a pretty intense natural grade change. It kind of goes down, Carolina is here, the back lots are lower than he is, and the water is kind of running directionally already. And I think he would claim that his neighbors have exacerbated that, and where it was a certain way, it's now worse for him, I think is how he would describe it. David, I think you're kind of in a similar, you might be in a similar situation to what Mr. Bonds was in, and you weren't here for his, but I think David was next to a property, got redeveloped. That property complied with all of the lot coverage standards. They had a drainage plan. Debatably, the builder, I think, initially completely ignored the drainage plan and then kind of gave it as little lip service. I think we eventually, through a lot of hard work through Matt, we got him to
Get
do what
close.
his drainage plan generally said he should be doing. But that's a good example of, people kind of run ramshot over projects, and it takes a lot of hand-holding and a lot of scrutiny to get that
Probably
done.
building the house the same way.
But that's an example of, they met the lot coverage limitation, and I think debatably that in and of itself just wasn't enough to keep water from running into David's line. And in that situation, they had a little bit of a gully design between the two houses. They initially didn't do it, came back, kinda did it, came back again, kinda did it again, but for the benefit of the group, how did that's a good example of how our current ordinance works. And I think we would only change this ordinance if we had knowledge that this ordinance isn't working well, which I think would be Mr. Bonds's point. And I think, David, you would have a good, just kind
Yeah,
of.
so the property, it was an old J.C. Long, 750 square foot house. They've tore it down, and what is it, 3,500 square feet, is that roughly?
Yeah, something.
You know,
Elevated, two-story.
they raised the entire lot, sloped it, everything away from the lot, and so it's a house. I guess it's
10-foot
supposed to be
setbacks, so kind of
10
pretty.
foot, well, I think they're actually a little bit more than that,
Okay.
probably close to 15. But again, much bigger footprint house. I guess the pool deck is, and it's a pool deck back impervious, so it's almost set back to, built within the setbacks. And everything's drained off. So the amount of runoff just from the house, which now doesn't get accounted for like in the pool area, so it goes back into that back 25-foot wide buffer zone, which just slopes into not my house anymore, but the people behind them. So any water running off that house is just going off. Has to be a lot more runoff going off now than when the 750 square foot house was sitting in the front of the lot. But they kind of complied with everything in there, except that I really don't believe if they had done a calculation of what ran off the property before and what runs off of it today, and I don't think that was ever done.
Okay, so we address that.
We address that here,
Yeah.
again, and it's really tough for these guys because they gotta rely, a landscape architect came in and signed off that said, it's not, but how do they prove it?
Well, and I guess the issue there is they're not saying it's not different. What they're certifying specifically is the runoff generated by this plan will not adversely impact the neighbors. So he's not saying it's not more.
The neighbors could take more runoff, so it's not gonna
So if it-
adversely impact them.
Well, I was just sitting here thinking.
Is that what you were thinking? Yeah, that's,
It's
So the
okay,
new
they
language,
needed more
does
water.
it or does it not address that?
So
It does.
this new language says it, this language says it has to be the same.
Except for maybe a practical, if it was a bad plan, that was the discussion,
Yeah,
And they
that
did
kind
the bad plan and it didn't work, there still has to be a practical evaluation of, this didn't work,
Yeah,
and maybe that's where we're coming to that whole discussion of the rain gardens or how much
Right.
retention that is built into these plans. I mean, I don't think we can do the engineering or what the engineering requirements are, I certainly can't, but I mean, that has to be in there somewhere so that at the end of it, did it practically work? When the house is built, is it flooding the neighbor's yard? If it is, it didn't work. Whatever you said the plan was, so then go back to, did you really do it?
So if you don't do anything to your lot and you build a house, in theory, you more than likely, even under your instance, let's say they didn't fill the lot at all, they just built the house. That probably wouldn't have generated as much of a problem as they filled the lot and then built the house. And where I'm going with that is what triggers needing to have, and I don't think our language is quite strong enough because of what you pointed out earlier is that, and you've said it too, that a landscape architect can kind of come up and say, yep, no, it's not going to adversely affect anybody. It's okay. Is that, who should be evaluating this? And I guess an engineer and a flow rate of guesstimating, because you can figure that out. If you've got X number of square feet of roof space, there's, in a half-hour rain or an hour rain, kind of what.
That's what we're trying to avoid.
Well, is it what we want to avoid?
Well, so I went off into a little tangent, can't find it on my computer. Architects have this book called Architectural Graphic Standards, which has a bunch of information in it, just graphically easy to read. But in there, it'll tell you how to size gutters and downspouts by telling you your area, the flow rate of rain. You calculate the slope of the roof, the quantity of the roof, and it'll tell you how big your gutter needs to be, how big your downspout needs to be. And that's a very simple, you know, you look at 2 graphs, 3 graphs, and you're there. It's no more difficult than if you were to figure out what your DP rating for a door or window needs to be. That's all out there in space, very simple maneuvering. It's in the residential building code, so it's simpler than if it was in the standard building code. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. If we could figure out something. Now, I think the trigger, getting back to what you're saying about the 625 square feet, you know, maybe it's more grade manipulation that's the trigger for the drainage plan, not necessarily the addition. Because if you built a house on an existing lot, built it on stilts, it was on Dewey's Island, you're not affecting drainage patterns.
Right.
You are having to deal with surface runoff from your house, but that's something then we could calculate and perhaps require that surface area, rain surface area of your house is self-contained or to some percentage contained. You know, if we could figure out what that is, if you had 1,000 square feet of roof and you've got, you know, I don't know how many cubic feet of rainwater per hour that you have, and how big then that pit might need to be, and how much can the ground itself absorb.
That's kind of where, when I've gone down this, and again, I've got about maybe like 80% confidence in what I think I've learned is, you know, ground out here can absorb roughly 4 to 6 inches of water, inches of rain per hour. Our typical rainfall is 3 inches. So if it's just raining on bare ground, there is no runoff per se. I know technically there's a little bit, but that's part where, yeah, having somebody understands this could tell me is, so if I can absorb another additional 2 inches or 3 inches of water beyond what our normal rain is, then yeah, it goes back to, I just drain the roof over onto an equal area, and I can make an assumption that I don't have to do the engineering calculations if I've done that. Now, if I want to go back and change what surface I'm using there, then yes, we're saying you would have to go back and do the engineering calculations to do, you know, if I put in pavers in, how much, you know, kind of goes back to the pavers. If I'm only trying to account for 3 inches of rain, I need 9 inches of gravel. I don't need 18 inches, and it will hold all the water that falls on it. Now, if I'm going to drain my roof onto my driveway, that's not good enough. Again, I don't know how to word that to say what's the limits, what can we reasonably assume before we go into having to have a engineer come in and do a whole analysis. And that's kind of where I was going, is that if we're going that route, then getting somebody that does that kind of stuff in to help us make that kind of call of not set a blanket requirement that everybody has to put a big gravel pit in their yard, because if you don't need it, why put it in there? If there's, you know, can you put in a rain garden instead? That way it only gets flooded on the very heavy rains, and I don't have to worry about the added cost of a gravel pit. I think that's a homeowner's kind of call. So again, I'm kind of not sure of where we need to go. I have kind of some ideas, but I'm not sure if they're reasonable compared to somebody that does this for a living.
Well, Douglas and Matt, are you all, do you have some ideas, given what we've discussed tonight, about maybe perhaps where to go to come up with a standard or a trigger that does what we're talking about?
So that,
Or
I
are we
think
back to
all-
Davis and Floyd?
I think that I'm kind of picking up from the conversation that all roads lead to hiring a professional. You know, I think we have kind of two two directions that we could go. Either kind of develop a super simple formula of 1,000 square foot roof, we run through something, or, you know, something that we could just come up with a standard and try to apply that standard. But I think anything more than that, and I mean, if we kind of really need to understand percolation rates and storm volumes and to develop that, I think we're needing to hire an engineer. And I don't think there's a problem with that. I mean, I guess we kind of casually tasked an engineer at our last meeting, not knowing that it was gonna generate a $20,000 bill, so I just wanted to
Yeah.
pause a minute. And I probably would, I mean, we have relationships with a lot of civil engineers. I do think they all do, you know, they all do municipal pipes and grounds. They're not the same engineers that are doing these these individual drainage plans, so we might.
And that might be a better approach.
maybe that
Again,
would
it's
be-
kind of,
Right.
yeah, I don't want to put a burden on all, you know, everybody that's doing a development that's not necessary, but are there, again, question is there reasonable things or trigger points that we could use to say,
But we probably need a professional
To
to
tell
tell
us
us that, and
Yeah.
basically to do the work to give us a simple solution.
Right.
right,
To put himself out of business. Because we don't want to have to hire him again. So, you know, in the village of Mount
Well-
Pleasant, where they have the overlay district for flooding, you have to have a civil engineer because they want all the hydrology calculations and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And the only people that will do it is Thomas and Nutton or Davis and Floyd. So you have little postage stamp lots and people are spending tens of thousands of dollars on these engineers. I don't think you need to do that. You know, it's kind of like, you ask a plumber, what are the rules of plumbing? Hot water on the left, cold water on the right, you know, what flows downhill and doesn't turn 90 degrees. You know, yet if you get an engineer, oh, you're into V equals IR and this and you have reduction and coefficients of
Resistance.
frictions and.
But I
It's
think
like,
there are-
come on, guys.
but there's probably
You don't have to
triggers
go
that,
there.
there are probably
Right.
triggers that should push us there, and that's
Well,
the,
they are.
and that's
it's-
what are they?
I think we'd be asking an engineer, quite literally, give us this information so we don't ever have to ask another engineer. Because we're trying to make this simple
Right.
for people to be able to use and digest. I remember, long time ago, good old Wild Dunes used to approve drainage plans. And I was a young whippersnapper architect with an attitude, and I said, what are you guys doing approving drainage plans? Not one of you knows what a drainage plan does. And they stopped approving them and just acknowledged them. Because you can get in a lot of trouble asking for something you don't know what you're asking for. And, you know, that being said, if you keep it simple, stupid, then, you know, you don't need engineers. Because if you have an engineer design plan, really, you should have an engineer reviewing the plan. We don't want to get into that.
We talked about getting into that.
Yeah.
That was one of Davis and Floyd's recommendations,
Right.
to kind of have you know, kind of have a retainer
Staff engineer.
arrangement with, and I think now the frequency of the plans is such that they probably could do it
Yeah.
at this point, and if we kind of rolled the requirement to pay into the building permit process where they kind of are paying for that review service as part of their submittal, probably is a doable thing. So I think all roads led us to a conclusion that we need engineering help. I would say between now, everybody kind of generally think we're
Yes.
there? Okay. So if we're there, let Matt and I let us try to find an engineer to kind of hopefully hire for a few hours of work. And I think the first 2 hours of work would be coming to this group's next meeting, kind of having a similar discussion as to what we had, and then see if we could come to some conclusions with that person and have them help on kind of an hourly rate to help us draft some language. Does that sound?
I vote yea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think, trying to find the smaller company as opposed to the big guys might help in finding simpler solutions.
Yeah, yeah, we do. We have our strongest relationship is with Thomas and Hutton, but they're kind of in that big municipal pipes in the ground boxes, not really the residential. So I think we would just look back at some of the better drainage plans submitted over the last few years of submittals and see if we can just talk to a couple of them, gauge their interest, and kind of agree to an hourly rate that wouldn't trigger kind of approval by council and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Sound
kind of
good?
go back to like Sandy's, if you just take an empty lot, build a house, put a gravel driveway onto it,
Do I need a drainage?
do I
plan?
need a drainage, I mean, yeah, if that's kind of the trigger point, if that's all you're doing, you don't need a drainage plan, how do we determine that? That's kind of where would think we'd be looking for is, again, is that trigger, what's the trigger point? What's reasonable to be expected runoff from that building in that kind of conditions?
Yeah, I mean, you have some properties that are high and dry all along Carolina and Cameron Boulevard. I don't think you have to have drainage plans for all of those, given our lot, restrictions, 30 and 35.
Now, those
might-
folks that are high and dry are that is specifically who Mr. Bonds is complaining, because all of his water is running. I mean, it is on a slope, so that water is running in a direction, and I think he would say it shifted it. It was kind of a flow in one direction, and now I assume it's flowing around the house, but they're on a hill, and
He's
that water's running.
downhill from it.
And he's kind of side. I mean, interestingly enough, he's on the side. And I will say, if you go stand, and it's really the gully washers, you go stand adjacent to his house, and there's just kind of rivers of water because it is on that hill, and it's kind of running through his lot.
And so, just at that point though, what, caused that to become somewhat exaggerated more recently was that they filled the lot when they worked on the property next door or uphill from him.
So this was adjacent to him. And
Okay.
it was a big, it was a little house. Now it's a big house.
What is
And
the
that's-
percent built upon on that house?
On his neighbor?
Yeah.
On his neighbor?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's now been 5-6 years ago, but I don't even think it was to our limit. It might be to the limit, 35%. Do you know the lot? It's kind of near,
It's like several houses up.
is it
You think
four?
on Carolina somewhere.
I think it's
600 block?
I think it's 400 block of Carolina. I could
That's
get
It's-
what I
that.
thought I
it's
saw. in
Fourth
his
and
email.
Carolina.
Fourth?
Fourth and
It
Carolina.
might be 408.
Okay.
The house that got built might be 408. He might be 406.
He's for us, you mean,
Carolina.
Wallace's,
Mhm.
Wallace Bonds' house. And that is high property. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
but if you're.
So
the
he
low
doesn't
guy
he
up
doesn't
the
have a
street-
settling, the water is not collecting, it's actually sheet flowing, which has been, he mentioned his bricks, that it kind of flows through his property.
oh,
He's 406.
406 Carolina, right?
mm-hmm. He's Wallace, he's 406.
Yeah,
Yes,
and the
Carolina.
house that got built was 408.
But that's been built a while.
Yes, that he mentioned how long ago it started. 5 years ago, did he mention?
Going back to this.
Well, again, what I was trying to say is that there's some high properties that I don't think would trigger a need for what we're talking about. Some properties coming off of, and I'm thinking walking 31st, 32nd, you know, as you come down the slope off of Cameron, Hartnett, if you're meeting the 30-35, depending upon what you're doing, where do we, again, back to, I need some help on what triggers our need for,
I very much like every new house has that plan built in. I mean, it gives us gives us just general kind of measuring points of, and I don't think we get pushback on that. I think, from my perspective, every new home, that's kind of not an issue. We do have a little bit of this, you know, 625 square feet. Have you really changed much? The other trigger that's in the code I would mention is 20% of the grade change. There are some instances where it seems like 20% of the lot
Yeah.
is a lot of grade change and they don't trigger it. So maybe we look at, you know, a square footage as opposed to because I think it's just a flat percentage. Occasionally that's an oceanfront lot, so it's an acre and a half. So 20% of an acre and a half allows a lot of grade change without getting a drainage plan.
yeah.
All right, it's Valentine's and 5:33. I think we have marching orders to reach out
Move to
to
adjourn.
try to have a civil engineer at our next meeting for you all to talk through these issues with. We'll try to kind of bring them up to speed as best we can on how you all have progressed so far and kind of sticking points and see if, get their thoughts going before the meeting.
Okay.
Very good.
I heard of one motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, you guys, I'll look at 5:33.